it is a beautiful time of life, and even there's even beauty in recalling the loss.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this is Colloquy, bringing knowledge from the university's PhD community to top-of-mind issues. I'm Paul Massari. Don't. That's the first of Roger Rosenblatt's new rules for aging, and the underpinning of many of the 114 other rules that follow in his forthcoming book of the same name. Don't try to catch that 20-something jogger who just left you in the dust on your morning walk. Don't criticize. Don't worry about awards or accolades or, for that matter, regrets. And don't retreat, especially to Vermont. Embedded in the wry and often funny maxims is genuine, hard-won wisdom gathered from a life now in its 9th decade of reading, teaching, and perhaps above all, writing. And Rosenblatt's here to share some of it with us today. Roger Rosenblatt is a New York Times guest essayist whose work has been published in 15 languages. The author of 5 New York Times notable books and 3 Times bestsellers, Rosenblatt has received 2 George Polk Awards for journalism, a Guggenheim Fellowship, an Emmy and the Peabody for his essays on the PBS NewsHour, the Briggs Copeland Appointment in the teaching of writing at Harvard, 7 honorary doctorates, the Kenyon Review Award for Lifetime Literary Achievement, and a Fulbright to Ireland, where he played on the Irish international basketball team. He got his PhD in English and American Literature and Language from Harvard Griffin GSAS in 1968. Roger Rosenblatt, welcome to Colloquy.
Thank you for having me.
So let me get the most obvious and perfunctory question out of the way. Your 2001 book, Rules for Aging, was a bestseller. So why'd you want to write a sequel? What have you learned in the intervening years that inspired you?
My wife, Ginny, has always liked the original book and said you ought to do another. And 2 dear friends, Gary Trudeau, the cartoonist, satirist, and Jane Pauley, the journalist, who are dear friends, have been barking at me for years saying you ought to do another one of these. It was interesting. When I started to do it, I thought, well, it'll just be more highfalutin wisecracks. And then the intervening years taught me so much more sympathy, frankly, about the very people whom I was addressing in the first book, that I came up with rules that you've seen and kind enough to read the book, that address those people, that address the sadnesses of life and the capacity to be more sympathetic with every situation.
So let's talk about some of those observations and some of those lessons, because, as I alluded to in the intro, your observations range from the wry and the very funny to the practical, to, at least for me anyway, sometimes the quite profound, as someone who's, getting a little long in the tooth myself. So what can a Charlie Chaplin film, and also a story about a meeting between the writers Coleridge and Wordsworth, teach us about the value of being still?
Coleridge and Wordsworth, that anecdote, simply that they lived near each other in the Lake Country, and that Coleridge came over to Wordsworth's cottage one day, didn't say a word, stayed 3 hours or more. He said nothing to Wordsworth. Wordsworth said nothing to him. At the end of the afternoon, they thanked each other for a perfect time. Now, to be sure, they use their silence, as very few people have, in the creation of beautiful things, but they meant it. Silence meant more to them than chatter. On Charlie Chaplin, have you seen this movie, Paul?
City Lights?
The City Lights?
Yes.
James Agee said that the last scene in City Lights is the best scene in any movie ever. And it's this silent scene where the tramp comes up to the young woman whom he is getting flowers, and whose flowers he bought when she was blind. and then he enabled her to see. So he enables her to see, but of course, when she sees him, she doesn't recognize him. By this time, he spent time in jail. He starts to walk away in that heartbreakingly sad way that Chaplin could do it. And then I just choke up thinking about it. Something tells her who it is. Nothing. There was no external evidence. Something told her who this man was. That this was the man who had been giving her money and buying her flowers, and who enabled her, in fact, to see by paying for the operation. Not a word is said, and the music comes up, and that's it. And it shows you that in the silences of life, there is a kind of beauty that is untouchable by noise.
That's so beautiful.
That's why silent films, by the way, that teaches you why silent films were so effective. Everybody made such a fuss about, oh boy, we've got sound. If they had waited a little, they would have seen that they had two things at once to be sure they had sound. But some of the silent movies are just wonderful masterpieces.
I'd love it if you could talk about what your Harvard mentor many years ago, one of your Harvard mentors, John Kelleher, taught you about not allowing learning at Harvard, of all places, to get in the way of enjoyment.
Well, this was Kelleher, and Kelleher was so great. There was nothing fancy about him. He used to talk about the fat asses in the faculty club. I'm not. He didn't shout it around the campus, but he would mutter it to me. He was just a regular guy who knew more about Irish history and literature than anybody ever before him, and I'm sure anybody after him. He had a terrible stammer, and the stammer drove away some students, which was lucky for those students, including me, who said, let me hang around a while and hear what he has to say. And what he had to say was pure gold. He, in his scholarship, looked at the famous story, The Dead by James Joyce, and found that The Dead was practically episode by episode an Irish folktale. And he traced the Irish folktale, and he didn't write very much. He wrote one book of poems himself, and no book of scholarship, just articles. And in one article, he showed that the dead depended on all these ancient Irish folktales. In other words, he found something that nobody else had ever found. And then he says at the end of it, of course, this has nothing to do with enjoying the story. And that was Kelleher. There was no bullshit about him. All he said, now that I've showed you the fancy way to look at it, you can also enjoy the story.
There's this other anecdote from one of your other new rules for aging that was really moving to me. I just finished reading, actually in an extension school class here, To the Lighthouse for the first time, Virginia Woolf's novel. You've got an anecdote in there, a story about an essay. So let me ask you, in that vein, what can we learn about death and also life from a moth and Virginia Woolf?
She would have been enchanted with that question, because that's exactly what I'm sure she meant us to ask. And she sees this moth batting about a corner of a window, and the moth is dying. And the moth tries and tries to right itself. She uses the word right the way it is, like putting something in the right position. But we hear the pun in writing too. And she admires the moth so much, and says of him that nothing equaled the kind of strength that it showed in fighting his own death. Years ago, I wrote a piece somewhere, I forget, maybe it was when I was writing for Time, on my regret of not having gone to Vietnam, though I was of the age that I could have gone, but I was in Harvard graduate school and married at the time and had my deferments. I didn't want to go to Vietnam because I cared about the war in any case, and what I knew about it, I hated the thought of art doing that. But I also hated the idea that there was a whole bunch of people in the country, a very large group of people who weren't protected by Harvard, who weren't protected by a number of things, and who had to go to that war, whether they liked it or not. So I wrote that piece. I said I regretted not that I wanted to fight in the war, but I wanted to be beside the people who didn't have a choice. And the guy sent me a framed motto, and it said, "Life has such rewards for those who fight for it that the sheltered never know." And he said that he would welcome me to his core. Um, that is the thing of the moth, uh, fighting fighting against, and this time fighting against mortality, which is an impossible fight, and yet still do it. There's another rule in there which comes in part from the original book, push the wheel forward, coming from a movie I saw when I was a kid about breaking the sound barrier. And it showed this pilot. Did you see this movie? I'll tell you, you'd love it. It was a fictional movie, but a non-fictional circumstance of all the test pilots going up and pulling back naturally on the wheel when it hit the sound barrier, and they get buffeting, 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 and they're saying that, etc. As soon as it hit the sound barrier, as soon as the plane started to shake, and they pulled back to slow it up, it cracked apart, and the pilots died. One pilot went up, and when the plane started buffeting, he pushed the wheel forward. Uh, I believe in that. I believe, all the things that argue against taking a chance, being brave in any number of ways, are usually worth it.
One of the reviews of Rules for Aging called it an antidote to positive thinking. And but along those lines, you have another of your new rules is go ahead and curse the light.
Yeah. You curse the darkness.
Curse the
Yeah.
darkness, right. Sorry.
That's the other thing that you were asking me about, the difference between the two books. This one, there were so many things that occurred to me that I had not really thought of before, like a run. If you hear "we must do this again," they don't mean it, you don't mean it, nobody means it, and it's uh, it's those things that are. Oh, the other one is the three reallys rule. If you hear three reallys from somebody sitting around, "I really like you, Paul. You're really the smartest guy I ever knew. You really can run a show beautifully." He's lying through his teeth. The third really betrays him.
I also loved what you had to say about the joys of rereading. Uh, I'm at a point in my life where I feel like there are so many things that I could spend, you know, the remainder of my years just going back through again and again, and you could never get to the bottom of them. Um, you mentioned in the book that a couple of things that you've been rereading are Moby Dick and The Great Gatsby. And I wonder if either or both of those two books have shown you anything in particular about the joys of rereading.
Yes, absolutely. I have a feeling that when you and I read these books, they were not meant for us. That we could do all the things that our teachers did in the concentrations at Harvard wanted us to learn, and we dutifully learned them. But there was no life experience that tested these things. So I used to think of Ahab and Gatsby when I originated as two nutcases. It was just a question of which pursuit defined them. Now, when you look at it again, particularly Gatsby, and there was one, so I reread Gatsby. There's a scene in Gatsby that I've never heard talked about, yet to me, Fitzgerald was finding the essence of the man. Poor Gatsby, stupid Daisy has already killed somebody in the car and has gone back to Tom. Gatsby, poor fellow, was worried about Daisy. Daisy's sharing fried chicken with Tom, the brute to whom she's married. She couldn't care less about having killed somebody. The two of them are in their home, and sitting outside the home to protect Daisy is poor Gatsby. And that in that scene, you know what true heartbreak is. The all that he hoped for in life, and all that was going to never be his.
Right. The reason why he was worth more than the lot of them put together, as
Exactly.
Nick Carraway says.
Exactly. And Nick didn't help him. Nick was sympathetic after he died, but Nick could have been of help to him too. Nobody was of help to Gatsby. who, for all his riches, was the one who needed the most help.
Right. You also, maybe for me, the funniest story has to do with your picnic on the Charles River. Can you tell that one?
The woman with whom I shared the picnic is sitting across the table from me. I'm not sure she's approving of what I said, but
Is that your wife,
it
Ginny?
is my wife Ginny. We're stuck with each other. So I want to tell you another story about the Charles. Then I'll tell you about the chicken leg. The Ginny and I went to a Bob Dylan concert at Brandeis, but Dylan didn't show up. So everybody was furious and a big thing. But he didn't show up. He didn't show up. Next day, the two of us go down to the Charles just to sit and take in the weather, and it was very nice. And I see a skinny guy trying to get a frisbee out of the river. And foolishly, he's hitting something in front of the frisbee, so naturally it goes farther away. So I, in my infinite wisdom, say to the skinny guy, who is Bob Dylan, if if you just let the tide carry it, it'll carry it ashore. So overwhelmed was he by this bit of wisdom. He said, "Do you want to join us?" The us was Joan Baez and he sitting alone, and Ginny and I, the four of us, and he sang Tambourine Man. For all I know, it was the first time it was sung.
Stop it.
And I know it. That isn't the story. I barely can tell that story because people think I'm making it up. I could not make this up. It was just great. But on the chicken leg, Ginny and I were having a picnic with some friends, and I'm sure I was pontificating. I'm sure I was gesturing with, like Toscanini. I was gesturing with a chicken leg in order to make a point, or in order to show what a smart fellow I was, all that stuff. I hold out the chicken leg. 4-year-old boy walks by, grabs the chicken leg, starts to eat it, and walks away. And Ginny turned to me and said, he thinks life is a chicken leg. And for him, it was.
Sometimes
Just
you just
waiting
have to grab it when
there.
it's out there in front of you.
Just take it. It's meant for you.
We've been talking a lot about your forthcoming book, but I want to talk to you about a column you wrote. I was reading a bunch of your recent New York Times columns, and you wrote one where you were talking about Robert Louis Stevenson's book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you were talking about how this idea that whatever you think impossible in life is possible. You wrote, life is stranger and more dangerous than anything you may ever imagine, and yet more forgiving too. And when I read that, I couldn't help but think of your essay for The New Yorker, Making Toast, and the story about the premature death of your daughter, Amy. I'd love it if you could talk about that sort of musing about life, both in the Times article and in your New Yorker essay, and how those experiences of grief and joy overlap.
That's a wonderful question, and it's a wonderful image because it's exactly what I think they do. When I wrote the piece for the New Yorker, Ginny and I were all grief. I managed the grief by writing. It was the only way I knew how. And so I wrote the piece, and then I wrote the book that followed it. But Paul, it took a long, long time for me to begin to see that something positive or quasi-positive could be made of what was to us the worst thing in the world.
She was a pediatrician, as I remember
Yes.
you writing it, and then it was just the the heart defect she had was like 1 in a million or something.
One and maybe more than that. After she died, I went around to various cardiologists just to try to understand it, you
Yeah,
know? And then they all said they never even seen it. They don't look for it.
yeah.
It is so rare. But now all these years passed, and while we still tear up and we um, talk of Amy, the daughter we miss, we also talk of the daughter we cherished and whom we remember was so full of life and humor and brilliance and all the things that you would want in a person, much less a child. And that is the way of salvation, to see the joy possible in grief. A friend of ours had a son die of suicide, which is the worst thing I could imagine.
Yeah.
And I practically wrote that essay for her, saying this is a third stage of grief, that there is shock, and then there's mourning, and then there is a touch of joy.
We posted on our news site, I can't remember whether it was last year, year before, your piece, the piece that you wrote for the Times after the passing of Helen Vendler, who, the poetry critic who was on Faculty of Arts and Sciences here, beloved teacher. Um,
Fabulous.
I didn't know at the time you'd also been friends with Jules Pfeiffer, the political cartoonist and the writer, the architect David Childs, and the essayist Lance Morrow, all of whom have died recently as well. And I'd love it if you could talk about how, because you mention it in New Rules for Aging, how you incorporate the reality and the increasing frequency of loss into what you've described as the October of your life, which is October, at least up here in New England, is maybe the most beautiful season.
It is. And when I wrote that piece for the Times, I said that October is a beautiful, I think I wrote the line, October is a beautiful month, don't you think? The idea that it is a beautiful time of life, and there's even beauty in recalling the loss. My study, which is a few feet away, has a Jules Pfeiffer, uh, more than one Jules Pfeiffer drawing, a picture of Lance Morrow and me when we exchanged the essay slot at the Times, and they used it in an ad, picture of David Childs in for a memorial service. And I began to think I have all these old friends with me and around me, and the memory of them is cherishable. But when you reach this time of life, you never think this is going to happen. These are the people who should be a phone call away,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or an email away, and now they're just away.
I have to admit, selfishly, I can't help but ask you some questions about storytelling and writing. As someone who's a storyteller and a writer myself, having the opportunity to learn from you and hear what you have to say. You've been a storyteller for much of your life. Um, I read what you wrote about maybe the first story you ever told. And I'd love it if you could tell that story and talk about how it set you on the path that turned out to be really a writing life.
My maternal grandfather, I called Pata. His name was Joachim Spruck, and he was an artist in Berlin. But when they came over with that wave of immigrants at the turn of the century, he couldn't find work as an artist, so he became a sign painter in the Bronx. My family lived in Gramercy Park on the east side, not the Lower East Side, but around 20th Street on the east side. And he lived on the Lower East Side, but on the way home, he would always stop and tell me a story. He would sit at the end of my bed. And one night he sat at the end of my bed and didn't say anything. And I said, Pata, my name for him, Pata, aren't you going to tell me a story? He said, why don't you tell me a story, Raj? And I said, story? I don't know any story. He said, well, what did you do today? And Mrs. Morris, a neighborhood mother, had taken a bunch of kids to Palisades Amusement Park. We went to the park and we did all the rides. Then we swam in a pond in the park, and I could see that I was holding his interest. I could see uh, his intent face, and so I started to make some stuff up. I said, and then a crocodile came into the pond and started to chase us kids, and I ran up the hill to a cave. Luckily, there was a polar bear there having cotton candy, and he shared it with me. Now, now, I looked at my grandfather with the sweetest smile on his face, and I knew what it was to hold somebody's attention with words. And so I always traced my interest in enthusiasm for writing. And you must have the same kind of story um, uh, to that to that moment.
I don't have a story with my grandfather asking me to tell him a story. I just have the one about my grandfather telling me stories, and he was
And
so spellbinding.
well, that's it. You remember the feeling in yourself. Uh, and he just made my grandfather just made it easy for me by flipping it and saying, "You try this for a change."
Right. I'd love it if you could talk about the components of good writing, um, and how they've carried you through 60 tumultuous years of being a writer.
I'll start with one of them, which is true, which is the importance of the noun. People always say verbs are so important because you can see the action in it. But I ask you to concentrate on the noun because the noun gives you the picture of the thing itself. If I say house to you, you picture a house. And Emerson had a quote, which I forget, on the importance of the noun. And along with that is don't overload your descriptions. So if it takes you three adjectives to describe something, you have the wrong something. It should never, it should never take you that much. I mean, writing is the science. It is a grand mystery in which you and I and others who practice it are very lucky. And one of the mysteries is how something comes to you. Richard Wilbur, great fellow, great poet, said, things will come to you. The chair, the throne will come to the queen as she's about to sit down. The binoculars will come to the general as he is about to look over a field. And an inspiration will come to you as you are about to write. And it's true. So when my students said, I have writer's block, I haven't been able to write in weeks, etc., I said, don't push it. Go for a kayak ride or a bike ride or a run or a long walk. Something will come to you. And if nothing comes to you after that, I said, try something else to do. Precision goes with what we were saying before. With if you have three adjectives, you have the wrong noun. But it's very hard to remember that the reader is there for your embrace. You have a life, a thought, a line of a poem, a story, and you think enough about this invisible reader to want to share that.
From the Harvard Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, this has been Colloquy. This podcast is an extension of the school magazine of the same name. You can find a transcript of the show, as well as past episodes, at the Harvard Griffin GSAS website, gsas.harvard.edu/colloquy-podcast. If you enjoyed this interview, please rate the show on Apple or Spotify, or like it on YouTube so that others can find it as well. And be sure to follow us on those channels so you'll never miss a conversation. Our theme music is from the Boston-based band Francine. I'm Paul Massari. See you next time.